And bloody as was the conflict, its results were indecisive. No enemy appearing on the 7th, Grant boldly started to Spotsylvania Court House, only, however, to find the Confederates ahead of him, and on the 8th and 9th these turned their position, already strong by nature, into an impregnable entrenched camp. Grant assaulted their works on the 10th, fiercely but unsuccessfully. There followed one day of inactivity, during which Grant wrote his report, only claiming that after 6 days of hard fighting and heavy losses, the result up to this time is much in our favor, but expressing, in the phrase which immediately became celebrated, his firm resolution to "fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." On May 12, 1864, Grant ordered a yet more determined attack, in which, with fearful carnage on both sides, the Union forces finally stormed the earthworks which have become known as the "Bloody Angle." But finding that other and more formidable entrenchments still resisted his entrance to the Confederate camp, Grant once more moved by the left flank past his enemy toward Richmond. Lee followed with equal swiftness along the interior lines. Days passed in an intermitting and about equally matched contest of strategy and fighting. The difference was that Grant was always advancing and Lee always retiring. On May 26, Grant reported to Washington, "Lee's army is really whipped. The prisoners we now take show it, and the action of his army shows it unmistakably. A battle with them outside of entrenchments cannot be had. Our men feel that they have gained the morale over the enemy, and attack him with confidence. I may be mistaken, but I feel that our success over Lee's army is already assured." That same night Grant's advance crossed the Pamunkey River at Hanovertown, and during another week, with a succession of marching, flanking, and fighting. Grant pushed the Union army forward to Cold Harbor. Here Lee's entrenched army was again between him and Richmond, and on June 3 Grant ordered another determined attack in front to break through that constantly resisting barrier. But a disastrous repulse was the consequence. Its effect upon the campaign is best given in Grant's own letter, written to Washington on June 5. "My idea from the start has been to beat Lee's army, if possible, north of Richmond; then, after destroying his lines of communication on the north side of the James River, to transfer the army to the south side and besiege Lee in Richmond, or follow him south if he should retreat. I now find, after over 30 days of trial, the enemy deems it of the first importance to run no risks with the armies they now have. They act purely on the defensive behind breastworks, or feebly on the offensive immediately in front of them, and where, in case of repulse, they can instantly retire behind them. Without a greater sacrifice of human life than I am willing to make, all cannot be accomplished that I had designed outside of the city." During the week succeeding the severe repulse at Cold Harbor, which closed what may be summed up as Grant's campaign against Richmond, he made his preparations to enter upon the second element of his general plan, which may be most distinctively denominated the siege of Petersburg, though, in fuller phraseology, it might be called the siege of Petersburg and Richmond combined. But the amplification is not essential, for, though the operation and the siege works embraced both cities, Petersburg was the vital and vulnerable point. When Petersburg fell, Richmond fell of necessity. The reason was that Lee's army, enclosed within the combined fortifications, could only be fed by the use of 3 railroads centering at Petersburg, one from the southeast, one from the south, and one with general access from the southwest. Between these, 2 plank roads added a partial means of supply. Thus far, Grant's active campaign, though failing to destroy Lee's army, had nevertheless driven it into Richmond, and obviously his next step was either to dislodge it or compel it to surrender. Cold Harbor was about 10 miles from Richmond, and that city was enclosed on the Washington side by 2 circles of fortifications devised with the best engineering skill. On June 13, Grant threw forward an army corps across the Chickahominy, deceiving Lee into the belief that he was making a real direct advance upon the city, and so skillfully concealed his intention that by midnight of the 16th he had moved the whole Union army with its artillery and trains about 20 miles directly south and across the James River on a pontoon bridge over 2,000 feet long to City Point. General Butler, with an expedition from Fortress Monroe, moving early in May, had been ordered to capture Petersburg, and though he failed in this, he had nevertheless seized and held City Point, and Grant thus effected an immediate junction with Butler's force of 32,000. Butler's second attempt to seize Petersburg while Grant was marching to join him also failed, and Grant, unwilling to make any needless sacrifice, now limited his operations to the processes of a regular siege. This involved a complete change of method. The campaign against Richmond, from the crossing of the Rapidan and the Battle of the Wilderness to Cold Harbor and the change of base to City Point, occupied a period of about 6 weeks of almost constant swift marching and hard fighting. The siege of Petersburg was destined to involve more than 9 months of mingled engineering and fighting. The Confederate army forming the combined garrisons of Richmond and Petersburg numbered about 70,000. The army under Grant, though in its 6 weeks' campaign it had lost over 60,000 in killed, wounded, and missing, was again raised by the reinforcements sent to it, and by its junction with Butler, to a total of about 150,000. With this superiority of numbers, Grant pursued the policy of alternately threatening the defenses of Lee, sometimes south, sometimes north of the James River, and at every favorable opportunity pushing his siege works westward in order to gradually gain and command the 3 railroads and 2 plank roads that brought the bulk of absolutely necessary food and supplies to the Confederate armies and the inhabitants of Petersburg and Richmond. It is estimated that this gradual westward extension of Grant's lines, redoubts, and trenches, when added to those threatening Richmond and Petersburg on the east, finally reached a total development of about 40 miles. The catastrophe came when Lee's army grew insufficient to man his defensive line along this entire length, and Grant, finding the weakened places, eventually broke through it, compelling the Confederate general and army to evacuate and abandon both cities and seek safety in flight. The central military drama, the first 2 distinctive acts of which are outlined above, had during this long period a running accompaniment of constant underplot and shifting and exciting episodes. The Shenandoah River, rising northwest of Richmond, but flowing in a general northeast course to join the Potomac at Harper's Ferry, gives its name to a valley 20 to 30 miles wide, highly fertile and cultivated, and having throughout its length a fine turnpike, which in ante-railroad days was an active commercial highway between north and south. Bordered on the west by the rugged Alleghany Mountains, and on the east by the single outlying range called the Blue Ridge, it formed a protected military lane or avenue, having vital relation to the strategy of campaigns on the open Atlantic slopes of central Virginia. The Shenandoah Valley had thus played a not unimportant part in almost every military operation of the war, from the first battle of Bull Run to the final defense of Richmond. The plans of General Grant did not neglect so essential a feature of his task. While he was fighting his way toward the Confederate capital, his instructions contemplated the possession and occupation of the Shenandoah Valley as part of the system which should isolate and eventually besiege Richmond. But this part of his plan underwent many fluctuations. He had scarcely reached City Point when he became aware that General Lee, equally alive to the advantages of the Shenandoah Valley, had dispatched General Early with 17,000 men on a flying expedition up that convenient natural sallyport, which was for the moment undefended. Early made such speed that he crossed the Potomac during the first week of July, made a devastating raid through Maryland and southern Pennsylvania, threatened Baltimore, and turning sharply to the south, was, on the 11th of the month, actually at the outskirts of Washington City, meditating its assault and capture. Only the opportune arrival of the 6th Army Corps under General Wright, on the afternoon of that day, sent hurriedly by Grant from City Point, saved the Federal capital from occupation and perhaps destruction by the enemy. Certain writers have represented the government as panic-stricken during the 2 days that this menace lasted, but neither Mr. Lincoln, nor Secretary Stanton, nor General Halleck, whom it has been even more the fashion to abuse, lacked coolness or energy in the emergency. Indeed, the President's personal unconcern was such as to give his associates much uneasiness. On the 10th he rode out as was his usual custom during the summer months, to spend the night at the Soldiers' Home, in the suburbs, but Secretary Stanton, learning that Early was advancing in heavy force, sent after him to compel his return to the city, and twice afterward, intent on watching the fighting which took place near Fort.